The air in the high Andes is thin enough to make your heart race, even when you're standing perfectly still. I used to think that rapid pulse was just the altitude, or maybe the biting cold that settles into your marrow at 14,000 feet. I was wrong. It was her, director Ellie Triss. I spent 3 excavation seasons mistaking her professional intensity for suppressed passion, reading love into the way she barked orders or checked my grid measurements. It took a stranger, a rival who didn't care about our carefully preserved stratigraphy, to show me the difference between being a useful tool and being a desired woman. Archaeology is a discipline of precision, of preserving the past exactly as it lies. Love, I learned too late, is about breaking the surface. For 3 years, the silence between us was a physical structure, as carefully built as the Inca walls we were excavating. We didn't need words. Ellie Triss didn't believe in chatter. She believed in results, in the sanctity of the context, in the absolute preservation of the data. I became an extension of her will. If she reached for a line level, I had it in her hand before her fingers could close on air. If she frowned at a soil discoloration, I was already scraping a sample for flotation analysis. We were telepathic in our workflow, a seamless machine of excavation that the rest of the crew watched with a mix of awe and intimidation. I wore that efficiency like a badge of honor, not realizing it was actually a suit of armor she had welded around us to keep everything else out. The night digs were the most dangerous times for my heart. At 14,000 feet, the sun creates a brutal, blinding environment. But the night is a different creature entirely. We worked under the high-voltage hum of portable halogen floodlights, the beams cutting cones of white brilliance out of the absolute, suffocating darkness of the mountains. The rest of the camp would be asleep, zipped into thermal bags, but Ellie preferred the clarity of the night. She said the shadows revealed textures in the stonework that the noon sun flattened out. So I stayed up with her. I always stayed up with her. I remember one shift specifically, just weeks before everything changed. We were clearing a suspected offering cache in Sector 4. The trench was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people, forcing a proximity that felt electric in the freezing air. The only sounds were the wind howling through the pass and the rhythmic shuck-shuck of our Marshalltown trowels scraping against the hard-packed earth. It was a hypnotic, sensual rhythm. My shoulder brushed against hers every time I leaned in to brush away loose sediment. In any other context, a shoulder check is nothing. Here, in the sensory deprivation of the night, the friction of her heavy canvas jacket against mine felt like a brand. The air in that trench was thick, charged with the smell of ozone from the lights and the dry, ancient dust we were disturbing. I could hear the steady intake of her breath, see the small clouds of condensation leaving her lips. At one point, she stopped digging. I froze, my hand hovering over a ceramic shard. She didn't look at the artifact. She looked at me. Her gaze was heavy, unflinching, a physical weight that settled on my skin. She reached out, and for a terrifying, wonderful second, I thought she was going to touch my face. I thought, this is it. The strata is breaking. Instead, her gloved hand adjusted the headlamp on my helmet. "You're missing the gradient," she said, her voice rough with the cold and hours of disuse. "Focus on the soil composition, not the depth." She pulled back, the moment snapping shut like a locked case. I nodded, swallowing the disappointment that tasted like copper in my throat. I went back to scraping the earth, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. That was the tragedy of us. I mistook her reliance for intimacy. I thought because she trusted me with the most delicate extractions, she trusted me with herself. I thought the silence was comfortable, a shared language of 2 souls who didn't need to speak to understand. I didn't see it for what it was, a vacuum. Ellie viewed me as a crucial instrument, a high-precision tool that kept her expedition running flawlessly. She valued my hands because they were steady. She valued my mind because it organized her chaos. But she didn't see me. She saw the work. And I was so in love with the proximity, with the privilege of being the only one allowed in her orbit, that I let myself be just another artifact in her collection, cataloged, stored, and kept perfectly, safely in the dark. I didn't know that safety was about to be shattered by someone who refused to whisper. The equilibrium of our silent ecosystem didn't decay naturally. It was smashed open by a helicopter rotor. Dr. Julianne Solis didn't arrive so much as she occurred, a sudden, vibrant event that refused to be ignored. She was the visiting cultural anthropologist, sent by the university to contextualize our hard data with living history. To Ellie, she was a contaminant. To me, she was the first person in 3 years who looked at me and didn't see a shovel. Julianne stepped onto the frozen mud of the base camp, wrapped in a scarf the color of burnt ochre, bringing a flush of heat into our grayscale world. While Ellie stood rigid, arms crossed over her chest like a barrier reef, Julianne moved with a fluid, liquid grace that seemed immune to the altitude. She didn't salute the director. She walked straight up to me, pulled off her glove, and offered a hand that was shockingly warm. Her skin was soft, a startling contrast to the rough, callous textures of our excavation. "You must be the specialist keeping this operation from collapsing under its own stoicism," she said, her voice a rich contralto, vibrating in the thin air. She didn't let go of my hand immediately. She held it, turning it slightly to inspect the calluses, her thumb brushing against my wrist where my pulse was suddenly erratic. "Precision," she noted, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "I can feel the discipline in your grip." Ellie stepped in then, physically cutting the line of sight between us. "Dr. Solis, we operate on a tight schedule. Fraternization delays the dig." "It's not fraternization, Director," Julianne countered, her smile slow and dangerous. "It's anthropology. I'm studying the culture of the camp. And right now, the culture seems starved." That was the spark. Ellie dismissed Julianne's field as soft science, a collection of fables with no place among stratigraphy's hard facts. But I saw the tightening in Ellie's jaw. It wasn't professional disdain. It was territorial aggression. She looked at Julianne not as a colleague, but as a predator circling her kill. The tension came to a head during the evening briefing 2 days later. We were crammed into the command tent, the canvas walls snapping in the wind. I was presenting preservation data from Sector 4, pointing out delicate stabilization work on a crumbling textile fragment. Usually, these briefings were dry, rapid-fire exchanges of data. Julianne changed the room's physics. She sat to my right, close enough that I could smell her. Sandalwood and expensive coffee, a stark contrast to the camp's diesel and dust. She didn't look at the projector screen. She watched me. I faltered in my presentation, losing my place for the first time in 3 years. Her gaze was heavy, unflinching, tracking the movement of my hands as I gestured to the map. It felt like being touched. "The way you stabilize that weave," Julianne interrupted, her voice dropping an octave, turning the professional observation sultry. "It's not just technical skill, it's empathy. You touch that fabric like you were afraid of hurting it. Most people here treat the past like a corpse to be autopsied. You treat it like a lover to be woken up." The silence was absolute. The air thickened, charged with sudden, suffocating heat. The jealousy was a living thing in the room, sharp and jagged. I felt a flush rise up my neck, hot and exposing. Julianne's eyes were dark, amused, and terrifyingly direct. She was stripping away the professional armor Ellie had welded onto me, exposing the soft, wanting creature underneath. Ellie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping violently against the floorboards, a sound like a gunshot. Her face was pale, her eyes hard chips of flint. "Your report is finished," Ellie said, her voice clipped and cold. She didn't look at Julianne. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw panic behind the control. "We need to reevaluate the perimeter sensors in the North Ridge. It's a solo job. You'll head out at dawn." The North Ridge was the most isolated, desolate part of the site, miles away from the main camp and miles away from Julianne. It was a punishment. It was a quarantine. Ellie wasn't managing the expedition's logistics. She was managing the threat to her ownership. She saw the way Julianne looked at me, with hunger, with appreciation, and her response was to bury me deeper in the cold, where no one else could reach. She thought distance would fix the problem. She didn't realize she had just confirmed the stakes. The arrival of the international donors was a seismic event. These were the check signers who forced Ellie into dress blues, turning the mess tent into a theater of white tablecloths and dim lantern light. Ellie vibrated with tension, greeting guests with handshakes that felt like contract disputes. She was a wall of data, impenetrable, cold, and utterly terrified of the social performance required to keep us funded. Then there was Julianne. If Ellie was stone, Julianne was the water, finding every crack. Dressed in shimmering silk that refused to bow to the mountain's grit, she charmed the room, translating Ellie's dry statistics into narratives of human endurance. I tried to make myself invisible near the buffet, hands still stained with red dust, feeling like a rough tool in a room of polished silver. Julianne found me immediately. When a donor asked about preservation, Ellie started reciting chemical compositions. But Julianne cut in. "You're asking the wrong person," she announced, her voice carrying easily. She turned, shifting the room's gravity toward me. "The director manages the site. But the heart of this expedition? The hands that save history from turning to dust? That's her." Every head turned. Ellie froze, her mouth slightly open. Julianne walked into my personal space, the scent of sandalwood overwhelming the tent's stale air. "Show them," she commanded softly. Not an order, but an invitation. I hesitated, lifting my hands. Julianne took my right hand, her skin shockingly warm and soft against my calluses. She displayed my palm like a rare artifact. "Look at that," she told the room, her thumb tracing my lifeline with deliberate pressure that sent heat straight to my stomach. "These calluses aren't from rough labor. They're from precision." She locked eyes with me, ignoring the donors entirely. "It requires a specific passion to be this gentle with something so old," she murmured, her voice dropping to a sultry register that thickened the air. "To know exactly how much pressure to apply before something breaks. It's an intimate knowledge, unflinching. You have to feel the fracture before it happens." The subtext was deafening. She wasn't talking about pottery. She was talking about touch. The donors were captivated, seeing the romance of the work. But I was looking at Ellie. She stared at Julianne's hand on mine, face blank, blood drained away. Her hands were clenched white at her sides. It wasn't annoyance. It was rage. Pure, unadulterated possession. She looked like she was watching someone burn down her house. Julianne's thumb brushed my wrist again, lingering on the pulse point. "Director Triss," the donor started. "Your specialist is—" "We need to discuss logistics," Ellie interrupted, her voice a whip crack. She crossed the room in 3 strides, inserting herself physically between us, a wall of navy wool severing the connection. It was a violent, protective maneuver. She glared at Julianne with a ferocity that would make a lesser woman flinch. "Wind speeds are picking up," Ellie said, breathless. "The donors need evacuation protocols. Now." She used safety as a weapon to separate us. Julianne didn't back down. She just smiled, a slow curve of lips that said she saw the fear and the jealousy. "Of course, Director," she said, stepping back but holding Ellie's gaze. "Safety first. We wouldn't want anyone to get carried away." Ellie herded the donors to the map table, her movements jerky. When the tent cleared, Ellie finally turned to me in the wreckage of the evening. She looked at my hand, the one Julianne had held, and for a second, I thought she might reach for it, might try to overwrite the sensation with her own. "Clean up this mess," she said instead, voice hollow, "and get to sleep." She marched out into the cold, leaving me standing in the warm, scented air, skin still burning where Julianne had touched me, heart aching for the woman who would rather freeze than admit she was on fire. The invitation wasn't a request. It was a tactical maneuver. Julianne approached the command table at breakfast, map in hand, and pointed to a settlement in the lower valley. She needed a survey of the local clay sources to cross-reference with our pottery finds. It was a valid scientific inquiry, the kind that justified funding, and she knew Ellie couldn't refuse it on professional grounds. Ellie tried, though. She stood rigid over her coffee, scanning the schedule for a conflict, for any excuse to keep me within the perimeter of her control. "The specialist is cataloging the Sector 4 textiles," Ellie argued, her voice tight. "Her time is allocated." "Allocations change," Julianne countered smoothly, her eyes dancing with challenge. "Unless, of course, the great director Triss is unable to manage the site alone for 6 hours?" The challenge hung in the thin air. Ellie's jaw worked, a muscle feathering under the skin, but she had no choice. She nodded once, a sharp, dismissive jerk of her chin, and turned back to her charts without looking at me. It was a dismissal, but it felt like a retreat. The drive down into the valley felt like an escape. As the Jeep descended, the air grew thicker, richer, filling my lungs in a way the high-altitude atmosphere never allowed. Away from the sight, away from the constant, heavy pressure of Ellie's expectations, I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in months. Julianne drove with one hand on the wheel, relaxed and open, filling the silence with questions that had nothing to do with carbon dating or soil strata. She asked about my childhood, my favorite books, the music I missed. She was excavating me, peeling back the layers of professional function I had buried myself under. We stopped near a riverbed to collect clay samples. I was kneeling in the mud, trowel in hand, my natural state, when Julianne crouched beside me. She didn't look at the ground. She looked at my profile. "What do you want?" she asked. The question was so broad, so unscientific, I didn't understand it. "I want to find a match for the ceremonial vessels," I answered automatically. "No," Julianne corrected, her voice low and insistent. "I know what the director wants. I'm asking what you want. Do you want to spend the rest of your life freezing on a mountain for someone who only speaks to you in commands? Or do you want to be seen?" The words hit me harder than the altitude sickness ever had. I looked at her, startlingly close, her expression open and warm. I realized then how small my world had become. I was useful to Ellie. I was essential even, but I wasn't seen. To Ellie, I was the hands that did the work. To Julianne, I was the reason for the work. The drive back up the mountain was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a terrifying realization. I was starving, and I hadn't known it until someone offered me bread. We returned to camp after dark. The wind had picked up, stripping the heat from the engine block the moment we killed the ignition. I walked into the command tent expecting emptiness, but Ellie was there. She was sitting at the main desk, illuminated by a single lamp, surrounded by paperwork she clearly wasn't reading. She looked up the second the flap opened, her eyes dark and unreadable. The air in the tent was heavy, pressurized, like the moment before a structural collapse. "Report," she said. It was a command, but her voice lacked its usual steel. It sounded frayed. I walked to the desk and placed a clay sample between us, a raw, unformed lump of earth. "The composition matches the ceremonial shards," I said softly. Ellie reached for it. I didn't pull my hand away fast enough. Her fingers brushed mine, cold leather against my skin, and she froze. She didn't grab the sample. Her hand hovered over mine, trembling slightly. For a heartbeat, the professional distance evaporated. She wasn't checking the artifact. She was sensing the heat of my hand. The air charged between us, electric and terrifying. She leaned in, just an inch, her eyes dropping to my lips, and I stopped breathing. Then the wind slammed against the canvas walls, a violent gust that shook the frame. Ellie flinched, snatching her hand back as if burned. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. Not the panic of the storm, but the panic of exposure. "Secure the sample," she whispered, turning her back to me. Outside, the first flakes of the blizzard began to fall, sealing us in. The storm didn't just arrive. It erased the world. Within an hour, the Andes disappeared behind a wall of white that screamed against the reinforced canvas of the command hub. We were buried. The only reality left was the 20 by 20 foot space of the tent, lit by the flickering generator bulbs and heated by a kerosene stove that hissed in the corner. It was a pressure vessel, and the seal was failing. Ellie sat at the main desk, her back to us, shoulders locked in that familiar, rigid posture of command. She was reviewing sensor logs, useless data given the blizzard, but she clung to the routine like a lifeline. She was trying to work the chaos into submission. Julianne, conversely, had surrendered to the confinement with terrifying ease. She lounged on the supply crates near the heater, legs stretched out, watching Ellie's back with a look of predatory amusement before turning her gaze to me. I was standing near the map table, shivering despite my thermal layers. The tension in the room was colder than the air outside. "You're vibrating," Julianne said, her voice cutting through the generator's hum. It wasn't a criticism. It was an invitation. She shifted, patting the wool blanket she had draped over the crates. Come here. The director might run on sheer will, but the rest of us need warmth. I hesitated, glancing at Ellie's unmoving back. She didn't react, didn't turn, but I saw her grip tighten on her fountain pen. I sat down next to Julianne, keeping a respectful distance, but she closed the gap immediately. She pulled the blanket around both of us, creating a private, intimate tent within the tent. The sudden warmth of her body against my side was overwhelming. I could smell the rain scent of her perfume, a sharp contrast to the diesel fumes and old dust. This place, Julianne murmured, leaning in so her breath touched my ear. It's beautiful, in a way, but it's a tomb. It's designed to keep things frozen in time. Nothing grows here. Nothing changes. She turned her head, catching my eyes. Is that enough for you? Stasis? It's preservation, I defended weakly, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. It's suspended animation, she corrected. Her hand moved under the blanket, finding mine. Her fingers interlaced with mine, deliberate and slow. I'm heading to the Amazon basin next month, the transition zone. It's the opposite of this. It's humid, chaotic, alive. The history isn't buried under ice. It's tangled in the roots of living trees. She squeezed my hand. I need a specialist, someone with hands that know how to uncover truth without destroying the life around it. It wasn't a job offer. We both knew that. It was a proposition. She was offering me a way out of the cold, out of the silence, out of Ellie's shadow. Think about it, Julianne whispered, her gaze dropping to my mouth. Warm rain, nights where you don't have to sleep alone for warmth, a partnership where you're allowed to speak, where you're allowed to touch. The silence from the desk was deafening. Ellie was listening. She had to be. The air in the tent stretched tight, a violin string wound to the breaking point. Julianne leaned closer, her intention clear, her presence a sultry demand that I make a choice. You have a fire in you, Julianne said, her voice a low thrum. Don't let her extinguish it just because she's afraid of the heat. Snap. The sound was sharp, violent. A gunshot in a library. We both looked up. Ellie hadn't turned around. She was still staring at the sensor logs, but her right hand was trembling. Ink dripped from her fist, black blood staining the map on her desk. She had snapped her fountain pen in half. The expensive resin lay shattered in her palm, a casualty of the force she could no longer contain. She stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floorboards. When she turned, her face was terrifyingly calm, but her eyes were wild. She looked at Julianne's hand on mine, at the shared blanket, at the intimacy she had refused to claim but couldn't bear to lose. The control was gone. The storm outside was nothing compared to the pressure building inside the room. The dam had finally broken. Dr. Solis, Ellie said, her voice vibrating with a tremor that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature. She didn't look up from the ink staining her palm. The perimeter sensors in Sector 2 are fluctuating. The data stream is corrupted. Go check the physical connections. It was a lie. We all knew it. The blizzard was burying the sensors under 3 feet of drift. Checking them now was futile, technically dangerous, and completely unnecessary for our immediate survival. But it wasn't an order about safety. It was an order about territory. Ellie was clearing the board. Julianne stood up slowly, the wool blanket pooling at her feet like a discarded robe. She looked from Ellie's clenched, ink-stained fist to my face, her expression shifting from amusement to something sharper, pity, perhaps, or recognition. She knew she had won the skirmish, even if she was being sent out into the cold. Don't let the fire go out, Julianne whispered to me, a final, smoky provocation, before grabbing her parka and pushing out into the screaming white void. The zipper of the tent flap hissed shut, sealing us in. The silence that followed was worse than the wind. It was pressurized, heavy with the things we hadn't said for 3 years. Ellie didn't look at me. She grabbed a rag and started scrubbing the black ink from her hand, the motion violent and repetitive, as if she could scour away the last hour. You're considering it, she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation thrown at the canvas wall. The Amazon. You're thinking about leaving the work we've done here for humidity and soft science. I'm thinking about going somewhere I'm wanted, I countered, the adrenaline finally overriding my deference. Ellie spun around, throwing the rag onto the floor. Is that why? Because she flatters you? Because she sees me, I shouted. You don't speak to me. You don't look at me unless I'm holding a trowel or logging a find. Julianne asks what I want. She doesn't see you, Ellie shouted, the volume shocking in the small, enclosed space. She sees a novelty. She sees a pair of hands she can steal to prove she's charming. She doesn't know how you work. She doesn't know that you hold your breath when you're uncovering a fragile weave because you're afraid your own respiration will damage the fibers. She doesn't know you need coffee at exactly 600 or you get a headache behind your left eye. She doesn't know you. She was breathing hard, chest heaving beneath her heavy wool sweater. The professional mask was gone, shattered on the floor alongside the resin of her fountain pen. I know those things, she whispered, the anger bleeding into something more desperate, more terrifying. I know everything about you. I built this entire season around your specialty. I kept the others away so we could work the night shifts, just us. I structured the entire expedition so I could be near you without breaking protocol. You never said anything, I said, my voice trembling, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. 3 years, Ellie. You never said a word. She looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I were speaking a language she hadn't deciphered. I didn't think I had to say it. I thought you knew. The words hung in the air, terrible and heavy. She took a step toward me, her hands twitching at her sides, wanting to reach out but paralyzed by the habit of restraint. I thought the work was enough, she confessed, her voice cracking. I thought if we were perfect together in the trench, you would understand that I can't function without you, that it's not just the expedition, it's me. You are the only thing in this world I am afraid to touch because I don't know how to do it without ruining the context. It was a confession, but it didn't feel like a romance. It felt like a landslide. Her love wasn't a partnership. It was a burden. It was a possession she had been hoarding in the dark, terrified that exposure would degrade it. She didn't love me as an equal. She loved me as a vital organ she was terrified to lose. She had confused need with intimacy, control with care. I was waiting, she admitted, tears finally spilling over, hot and unflinching tracks on her pale face. I was waiting until the work was done, until it was safe. But she came in and she just touched you. Like it was easy. Like you were free for the taking. She looked at me, stripped of all her authority, just a woman standing in the wreckage of her own silence. You're not free, she said, the possessiveness chilling the air more than the storm. You're mine. You've always been mine. I didn't know how to ask for permission. I should have fallen into her arms. That's the script, isn't it? The stoic director finally breaks, the confession spills out, and the subordinate melts into the embrace she's been craving for 3 years. But I didn't melt. I froze. Because the heat coming off Ellie wasn't warmth. It was the desperate, grasping heat of someone trying to save their property from a fire. I looked at her, ink on her hands, tears on her face, the absolute terror in her eyes. And for the first time, I didn't see a leader. I saw a hoarder. I stepped back. It was a small movement, barely a shuffle of my boots on the canvas floor. But in the geography of our relationship, it was a continental drift. Ellie flinched, as if I'd slapped her. She reached out, her fingers twitching in the air between us, but she hit the invisible wall I had just erected. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice shaking, but gaining strength with every syllable. You don't get to wait 3 years, watch me starve for a scrap of validation, and then claim me the second someone else offers me a meal. I was protecting us, Ellie pleaded, the desperation leaking into her tone. I was protecting the work. No, you were protecting yourself, I countered, the realization hardening into something sharp and necessary. You didn't speak up because you realized you loved me, Ellie. You spoke up because you realized you were losing. That isn't love. That's resource management. You're not fighting for a partner. You're fighting for an asset you forgot to tag. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. She recoiled, her back hitting the edge of the map table. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable, telepathic silence of the trench. It was the silence of a site that had been looted, empty, violated, and cold. I am not a site you can fence off, I told her, holding her gaze until she was the one who looked away. You don't get to claim provenance over me just because you found me first. If you wanted me, You should have had the courage to hold me when the sun was out, not just when you were afraid of the dark. The storm broke at dawn. The screaming wind died down to a whimper, leaving the camp buried in a silence that felt heavy and suffocating. When the light hit the canvas, gray and unforgiving, I packed my kit. I didn't ask for permission. I walked to the comms unit and logged a formal request to transfer my station to the lower lab tent, 300 yards away from the command hub. It was a demotion in terms of comfort, but a promotion in terms of sanity. Ellie watched me go. She sat at her desk, hands folded over the broken fountain pen, her face a mask of tragic, stony composure. She didn't order me to stay. She knew she had lost the authority to command my heart. Julianne was waiting by the transport jeeps when I brought my final crate down. The snow was blindingly bright, but she looked tired, her vibrant energy dimmed by the reality of the mountain. She saw the set of my jaw, the way I was carrying my own gear, and she understood the stratigraphy of the situation immediately. She didn't ask what happened. She knew. "I'm leaving," Julianne said simply, leaning against the roll bar of the Jeep. "The helicopter is inbound. My work here is done." "You're running?" I asked, setting the crate down in the mud. "No, I'm stepping back," she corrected, a sad smile touching her lips. She reached out, fixing the collar of my parka with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "I was never the destination, darling. I was just the catalyst. I was the chemical agent you needed to drop into the solution to see what would react." "She loves me," I said, the words tasting like ash. "But she loves me like she loves the artifacts. She wants to keep me in a box." "Then break the box," Julianne said, her eyes fierce one last time. I lit the fire. "It's up to you to decide if it burns the house down or keeps you warm. But don't let it go out." She boarded the chopper without looking back. As the rotors kicked up a blinding cloud of snow, I walked to the lab tent, alone. The distance between the command hub and my new station was only 300 yards, but for the next 3 months, it might as well have been an ocean. We entered a new era of the expedition, the era of cold, polite, devastating professionalism. 3 months is a geological epoch when you are living in a tent 300 yards from the person who broke your heart. The distance between the command hub and my lab tent wasn't just physical. It was a demilitarized zone. We operated in a state of cold, exquisite professionalism. The telepathy was gone, replaced by memos. The shared silence of the trench was replaced by the static of radios. It was lonely, but it was safe. It was the stratigraphy of self-preservation. Ellie changed. It wasn't a landslide. It was erosion. The wind of my absence wore down the sharp granite edges of her control. She stopped hoarding my time. For 3 years, she had filled my schedule with busy work, just to keep me in her orbit, terrified that an idle moment would lead me to look at the horizon. Now, she approved my requests for solo excursions without a second glance. She forwarded invitations for conferences in Lima, opportunities she used to hide in her desk because she couldn't bear the thought of the site running without my hands, or perhaps running without me under her thumb. The first sign of the thaw was the coffee. I arrived at my station one morning to find a thermos waiting. It was my specific blend, the one with the hint of cinnamon I liked, sitting on a coaster so it wouldn't warp the field notes. There was no note, no list of demands, just the heat rising from the steel cup in the freezing air. I looked across the camp to the command tent. Ellie was there, watching through the plastic window. When our eyes met, she didn't stare me down. She nodded, once, a small, jerky motion, and turned away. She was learning to give without taking. She was learning that care didn't require a contract. But the real excavation of her character happened with the season's final report. The university sent the proofs for the major discovery in Sector 4. Standard protocol dictated the director took lead credit. I expected nothing less. It was her expedition. I was just the tool she used to dig it. Ellie walked into my lab tent holding the thick manuscript. She didn't knock, but she didn't barge in either. She stood at the entrance, waiting for me to acknowledge her. She looked thinner, the lines around her eyes deeper, carved by 90 days of sleeping alone with her realization. "The board sent the proofs," she said, her voice rough. She walked to my desk and laid the papers down. She had taken a red marker and slashed a thick, violent line through her own name. Above it, in her precise architectural block lettering, she had written mine. "This is wrong," I said, staring at the red ink. "You're the director. You secured the funding."
"I secured the money," she corrected, her voice steady but quiet. "You secured the history. The analysis of the weaving technique, the dating of the dyes, that's your mind, not mine. I'm not putting my name on work I didn't do just to keep my status." "Ellie, this is the cover of the Quarterly. This is a career-making credit." "I don't care," she said. And for the first time in 3 years, I believed her. She looked at her hands that were usually clenched in fists or gripping tools, and opened them flat on the table. I used to think that if I didn't have my name on everything, it would disappear. If I didn't control every variable, the entropy would take over. She looked up at me, her eyes dark and unguarded. There was no command in them, only a terrifying amount of vulnerability. "I am learning," she whispered, the words sounding foreign in her mouth. "I am learning that things can exist without me holding them down. I am learning that if I open my hand, gravity doesn't always take everything away. Sometimes it just lets things be." She turned to leave, pausing at the flap. "You earned this," she said, not looking back. "You always did. I was just too afraid of your independence to let you have it." She walked out into the cold, leaving me with the proof of her evolution. I watched her go, her boots crunching on the permafrost. She wasn't the chief anymore. She wasn't the titan who barked orders to drown out her own heart. She was just a woman, standing in the wind, trying to learn a new language of emotion that didn't have any commands in it. The ice was cracking, not from the heat of a storm, but from the slow, persistent warmth of respect. She was finally excavating the hardest terrain of all, herself. The valley below was a void of black velvet, swallowed by the shadow of the Andean peaks. The excavation was officially over. The trenches were backfilled, the artifacts crated, and the history sealed away for another season. Usually, this was the moment Ellie vibrated with the anxiety of departure, checking manifests 3 times, terrified of leaving something behind. Tonight, she stood on the ridgeline, hands buried deep in her parka pockets, watching the stars wheel overhead with a stillness that frightened me more than her shouting ever had. I walked up beside her. I didn't announce myself. I didn't need to. The gravel crunched under my boots, and she didn't flinch. She just exhaled, a white plume of breath vanishing into the dark. "The manifest is clear," I said, the old habit of reporting dying hard. "I know," Ellie replied. She turned to me. The camp lights were distant enough that her face was a landscape of shadows and pale skin. She looked tired, worn down by the altitude and the emotional erosion of the last few months. But the frantic edge was gone. The stone had finally settled. "I'm not worried about the crates. I'm worried about the empty space where they used to be." She took a step closer, invading the demilitarized zone we had strictly maintained for 90 days. "I asked you once to be a tool," she said, her voice low and steady, lacking the tremor of the storm confession. "I treated you like a shovel, like something I could use to dig up the truth without getting my own hands dirty. I thought if I kept you sharp and cold, you'd never break." "You were scared," I offered. Not as an excuse, but as a classification. "Terrified," she admitted. "But I'm done managing the fear. I'm done managing you." She looked at me, her gaze heavy, stripping away the months of cold, polite distance to reveal the raw nerve underneath. "I don't want a subordinate. I don't want a specialist I can order into the dark to fix my mistakes. I want to know if it's too late to apply for a different position." "What position?" "Partner," she whispered. "Flawed. Unmanaged. Equal. I don't want to own you. I want to stand beside you." The wind bit at our cheeks, but the heat radiating from her was undeniable. This wasn't the possessive heat of the storm, the desperate grasping of a child losing a toy. This was the steady, banked heat of a decision made in the light. She wasn't claiming me. She was offering herself. "It's a high-risk excavation," I warned, my voice barely a murmur. "No protocols, no safety nets. If we break, we break." "I know the risks," she said. She reached out, and this time there was no hesitation, no trembling. Her gloved hand found my jaw,
her thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with a deliberation that stopped my heart. It was the touch of a master craftsman handling the rarest find of her career. It was unflinching. I've spent my life preserving dead things. I want to try living. She closed the distance. The kiss wasn't an explosion. It was an alignment. It was precise. Her lips met mine with a texture I had spent 3 years imagining. Firm, cool from the air, but burning with intent. It was a slow, deliberate read of my history. There was no desperation in it, only a profound, terrifying clarity. She tasted like cold air and absolute surrender. My hands found the lapels of her jacket, pulling her in, breaking the last stratum of professional distance. We stood on the edge of the world, not as director and specialist, but as two women who had finally dug deep enough to find the bedrock. When we pulled apart, the silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was a structure we had built, stone by stone, capable of weathering anything. We turned back toward the tents, not as a unit of efficiency, but as two people who had survived the dig. The drive down the mountain the next morning was quiet, but the air in the Jeep was light. We watched the site disappear in the rearview mirror, leaving the ghost behind. We were finally bringing home the only discovery that mattered. If you understand the weight of words left unspoken, subscribe for more stories from the field.